Hey everybody. I'm here at the pond where I, in other times, have practiced frog sneaking, which is the art of very slowly approaching a frog here, sunning itself on the shore. And this year there may not be as many or maybe even any frogs, since the pond is artificial, meaning that there's a tarp underneath it. But it's a very old pond. I've known it for at least 20 years. And I've watched it change and grow. I've observed it, but I've also participated. This tree here is a being, in my view. I'll wander around why that might be in a minute. But this tree has embodied the time of this place, the lived time of this place. It's not a recording device. It's something far better. Because although it is the embodiment of all of that lived time, and I don't mean hours or days, though we can think in these terms. I mean something at once more ordinary and transcendental to how we think about time. Usually, how we are, scripted to think about time. No, it's not a record. It's the embodiment of lived presence in the local field of relationships, from before the moment it sprouted, right, all the way back through its lineage to the beginning of life on Earth, to this tree here now, which the word tree is meaningless. It's just a token that points toward a category and an instance of a category and so on, if we're in our intellect. The tree transcends the intervals we're used to. It's not seconds or minutes or hours or days or months. That it is the embodiment, not of intervals, but of presence. Living awareness and relation with all of the beings, not just nearby, but all of their histories. And in some sense, one can imagine it as the local instancing of tree-ness. Not just its species here in this place at this time, but it's one of the local embodiments of all that trees are and become, all of their relations, their history. And what I experience of the tree depends on many choices that I make, even though for most of us we don't have a lot of choices here a lot of the time. But what my capacity for relating with the tree is either limited or assisted by my intention and my perspective. What I'm looking for, what I'm looking at, why I'm engaged at all. Right? And my hope today is to talk a bit about observation, time, and intent. Not necessarily in that order. Now, the question of whether the tree is a being or not has a strange, most people will agree that it belongs to the class of discriminables we call organisms, right? And we would think of it as vegetation. And so we would associate qualities that we've learned to recognize about organisms in general and about vegetation. Most of us would intuitively just apply those layers before we approach the tree in our awareness. And I've suggested before that when we make those usually invisible to us choices, we are not so much granting our minds wings as we are selecting you can go through if you want, yeah. We are selecting templates, habitual and familiar, that will limit more often than expand the opportunities we will be available to in terms of participation, relating with. We do this with each other, we do it with ideas, we do it with commodities, but we especially do it with living places and beings. So that we are inclined to dismiss the most of the relational manifold presented accessibly by living beings and places. And part of this is because we have acquired knowledge. Knowledge gets in the way. Where it doesn't not get in the way, it's in the way. Let me put it that way. So, when we approach, for example, a tree, and if you ask many people, do you think the tree is a being with something analogous or maybe beyond what you call awareness? Which doesn't necessarily mean that it's aware that it's an it, or they're aware that they're a they. We don't know exactly what it might mean unless we can contact the awareness of the tree with our awareness. And there are people who are inclined to suspect that a sort of, how shall I put this? They believe an anachronism, a myth, that is implied by our relationships with the categories. So that, for example, plants aren't available to an intentional, mutually intentional exchange of awareness. And they might think this, for example, because they think plants don't have brains. Trees don't have brains, so since they don't have brains, there's nothing really there for you to relate with other than it's beautiful or it's alive. Not everyone thinks this way. But the problem with approaching things from the categories we're trained to use is not only that they're incomplete, they're cripplingly incomplete. If we believe the myth that living beings don't have awareness, or if we say, well, they have something analogous, but it's much less, right? We're making a mistake that's not so much about whether trees are beings that we can have a relationship with or not. It's more about sort of making slices in our own opportunity pie, pulling out tiny slivers and throwing the rest away. And here's why. If I ask whether the tree can be my friend or someone I can relate with, it's a peculiar kind of question because it presupposes that there's a state of being the tree that is already there or not there, regardless of what we think. And our categories, our relationship with categories, informs or deforms or, amputates aspects of possibility so that we can conveniently get on with that stuff we're doing all the time, which most of the time is finding a way to skip over relational possibilities and get on to the thing that actually matters, getting the money, getting the job, doing the task, thinking the thinking. So the intellect can be deceptive, and it's often deceptive. And we have other, within the broad continuum of our accessible humanity, there are many assets implicit in our humanity with which we can approach relationships with living places and beings. And these are so explosively, the potential of these relationships is so explosively different and transcendental to what we do with words and categories and concepts and theories, that if we were to take the latter collection of stuff, behaviors and so on, compared to what I encompass when I talk about the living beings and the places and such, that little dust speck is microscopic in scope and ability, in embodied potential for transcendental insight and for the fulfillment of our humanity. And you could throw away intellect, and our humanity, what would rush into the vacuum that it often asserts and creates. And I have to use it against itself in my talk at the moment, which is ironic, but and beautiful and paradoxical, and maybe paradox is important here. Yes, compared to this little derivation moat the humans have done with their language and intellect and categories and such, what we are participating in as organs of nature, it's like comparing, a galaxy to a microscopic mote of sand. And yet, the intellect easily presents as authoritative. It knows what things are and what they do. So back to this question about trees and whether we can, our awareness, whether our consciousness can have a meaningful relationship with the being and the network of beings and the lineage of beings, that we could understand some tree not to represent, to embody. Now, in my view, this isn't a question. I'm asking what appears to be a question because I respect the confusion of people who, having no such experience of trees, and having received the same scripting I did about what they aren't, and that a single creature is a single creature, an individual, and so on and so forth, and that trees don't have minds, so they can't have anything like awareness or consciousness. That presumes that humans have knowledge they've never come near intellectually, and it's simply wrong. It's blatantly wrong. However, I'll probably have to give some analogies or examples to help show how it's wrong, or part of why it must be wrong. The first problem is that we have complete knowledge of organisms. We have not even 1% of knowledge about organisms. We know tiny little things that we've teased apart with intellect and research. Compared to organisms themselves, those things are very nearly useless unless you intend to turn organisms into commodities or hitchhike on their beyond all beyonds advanced embodiments of intelligence in relationships. And intelligence in relationships with time, with observation, like the flowers. Intent is a little trickier because intent is something, it's a quality I'm not ready to collapse into my discussion about organisms, plants, trees, insects, animals, sea creatures, microorganisms. So we have some frameworks that are cultural. And if we came from cultures that lived in relation with living beings in nature, we would have different frameworks. And in fact, the frameworks would be fuzzier. There'd be some play in there, some ambiguity, because there is, always. And what it gets taken up by for most of us is the framework, right? Trees are essentially growing things. You cut them up into lumber, blah, blah, blah. But there's a particular concern I have that I want to highlight, which is that some aspects of relation are not intrinsic. The fact that you are there and a tree is there does not mean you're going to be likely to sense immediately the opportunity to have an exchange, a relational, transfer with a tree or a plant. Particularly if you're in your intellect, but it's much easier if you're in your heart. And the question isn't really, can one have a relationship or relational exchange, an ongoing continuum of exchanges where both beings are honoring each other and maybe loving one another and relating with one another. Sounds superficially ridiculous about trees, but it's because of the imposition of the categories and what they evict from not our opportunity, but what we think. In other words, they change our intent. See? They delimit our intent so that many of us, probably don't believe it's useful to talk to trees, whether that's done in our heart, with our heart, like with our imagination, or with our mouths in human language. And we generally are trained to believe that communications happen in language. Another catastrophic deception. A collapse of the many possibilities of communication, a sort of artifact, like skeletal thing, happens with language over time. Language temporalizes experience because it gives it a sort of heartbeat of signals, emitted and received and forged and interpreted and so on. But there are older ways of communication that are faster and better and deeper and richer than speaking or writing. So I'm going to crib from a little bit here from the book Saving the Appearances, because it presents one of the best analogies that's relevant to what I'm orbiting. And it's not like that's the first book to present this analogy. But some of the opportunities inherent in our humanity are not presented directly to the intellect. In fact, they may make their first appearance in our nervous system, presuming we consider these distinct, and I know we don't have to, or our hearts. And I'm not intending to imply the dualism that language seems to impose here, or the trialism or the quadralism. They aren't different things so much as they are different faculties. They are distinguishable faculties. And if I approach a relational situation with the intent to gain a profit, in the sense of make money, I may want to just tear it down and sell the parts and, harvest, quote unquote, harvest the vegetation or hunt the animals. And so if I approach with the intent to discover whether and in what ways I can have meaningful relations with living places and living beings, one of the first things that happens is I move from the position of plausible superiority to humility, right? I get smaller, and I take off those frameworks that claim that humans know what stuff is and what's going on and what its qualities are and what its behaviors mean and so on and so forth. I take all that, I try to take as much of that off as possible. It can be challenging. But the reason that I'm telling this story, which I forgot to complete my sentence back there, was that I have compassion and concern for people who are interested, but it doesn't make sense to them. I was out with some really bright coders that my friend Josh introduced me to some time ago for dinner. And we'd been walking around the gardens and I'd been talking a bit about trees. And one of them turned to me entirely sincerely and said, "How do you relate with a tree?" So in part, I'm responding to that because, first of all, I didn't judge. If I judged what his question, I judged it sincere and entirely reasonable. And I think it's an entirely reasonable question. And in case I'm presenting the appearance that I'm a great tree communicator or something like that, please don't take that as my intent, because it's not, nor is it true. What I have is humility and the awareness that I've had these questions for 40 years or longer. What are the trees really? What are the insects really? What do they know themselves as? Not in the sense of knowledge, but in the sense of embodied participation in the unimaginable splendor of organismal symbiotic union, right? Something like this. So I feel really humble, and I don't have answers. What I am aware of are the limitations we ordinarily operate under, and how invisibly prohibitive and impoverishing they are. That's what I'm aware of. I know a little bit about that, right? And perhaps something too about trees. You'll have to ask them. Because I am not the arbiter. It's something between me and the trees, but not just the trees. You know, I'm using them as an example. So, first of all, I think the question is entirely honest and reasonable. And so I'm trying to respond to it a little today. And I did give him some modest answers. I said, come to the tree with your heart, pay attention, stay with it for a while. Its time is different from yours. Bring maybe an offering of some kind, some water, some earth, something that, the tree might recognize as a gift in its own non-human, non-representational way. Now back to my analogy from Saving the Appearances. The author of that book talks about the rainbow and asks, is the rainbow there? And the faculties and opportunities that we bring to human birth have a lot to do with questions like this. They don't have to do in the way our intellectual traditions imply so much with, what can we reliably distinguish about some phenomenon that we've divided from all other things and categorized and so on, and dissected and whatever. What can we surmise about that fits in with knowledge and our categories and logic and so on and so forth? This habit, while useful where it's useful, is a disaster everywhere it's not. And one of those places is in relationships. Research doesn't tell you what relationships are about. In fact, research is an intent that changes observation and participation in ways that we should keep clearly in our awareness, so that we know when not to use them. So one of the questions or answer, one of my responses to is the tree a being is, what if you are both transformed to something you couldn't previously be when you interact together, right? And the rainbow is kind of an analogy of this. One is interacting with light, usually in some kind of mist, but there are other kinds of rainbows. In fact, something not too many people are aware of is that if you look at the setting sun through the branches of a tree, you are likely to notice an astonishing phenomenon that I'll call a starburst, which is that the sun makes an astonishing like disc of little spikes of rainbow light that coruscate and are alive and transform. Is it there? Is it there without you? Is it there without the very place you stand on, the precise distance, if we want to make measurements, from the tree and the sun? Is it there without an organism to participate? Is it intrinsic to space that it suddenly fills with rainbows? No. Rainbows are a relationship. They're a relationship in the between, right, of a field of relationships of infinite kinds and accessibility. So if someone suggests to me that the tree is not aware, I might be inclined to suggest that, or to ask, do you think you might have any capacity to transform that? What if something about the awareness of the tree depends in some way on your participation? Because even if you decide trees cannot be aware, you're making a relational, you're relating with trees, right? And you're deciding, no, this is illogical. The trees could have or represent the opportunity for something transcendental to human minds, right? But how can you exclude all of the capacities of your own humanity, most of which remain undiscovered and unacknowledged and, hidden in little crypts of intellectual assertions and logic over the years when the birth of those things and their replacement of their progenitors was going on? And that's a really recent replacement. That old stuff that got replaced, our interpretations of it look superstitious. They are backwards. They are backwards. So, though I will admit it's my perspective that living beings have awareness of many different kinds, and they have different layers of awareness, and they are differently aware in different circumstances, just like we are. Whether I suspect, that organisms and ecologies aren't merely beings, they're something up tree, right? Up the category tree above being, that we don't really have a word for except gods or spirits, and those are so value-laden I don't want them right now. So it's my experience that this is so. I'm not trying to convince others of it, though I might ask them to consider it. Because it really matters if it turns out that, for example, the ecologies, our own minds are extensions of them, and the damage that happens there happens to us. That would be a very profound and seemingly to me inescapable consequence of our, the common human propensity to categorize, taxonomize, and dismiss. Dissect, categorize, dissect, taxonomize, dismiss. It's not the only thing that happens. It's just very, very common, though. And lethally common, in that it's deadly and it makes us forget. The various kind of coruscating, sparkling strata of awareness in a living place is not entirely unlike the starburst that emerges behind the tree at sunrise or sunset, as if to celebrate every time this ever happened in every being it ever happens to. A reassurance that the face of origin has returned from the ambiguity of night, and with its particular spectra of light awakens our eyes to distinction and color and shape, identity, whereas in the nighttime all of that's much fuzzier. Intent transforms what's available to our awareness. The methods we use to make cuts in the everything in our thought affect the choices, they delimit the choices of intent we can embody, we can enact. And when I see the tree, part of my intent is to forget the frameworks and habits that I'm accustomed to, and enter with humility and wonder and reverence and awe and imagination and heartfulness into presence with the living being I'm with. And seeing that being not just as an individual, but as an instance of the place, the histories, the coruscating layers of organismal awareness that together comprise a superposition far above what's available to a single organism, an accessible superposition. And that position lies staggeringly beyond anything that will ever be available to language and intellect. So for me, there's something better than space travel, which I was just apeshit over the idea as a kid. There's something far better than space travel. There's travel in the layers of awareness and intelligence that exist all around us that we're totally ignoring in a race to get off world in the hope that we'll find intelligence in the universe, by which we mean behavior that resembles our incredibly ignorant misbehavior with the intellect, right? They make categories out of things and dissect them and can tell us what they do in their theoretical, yeah, good luck with that. It's almost the opposite of intelligence, and it's so... I strongly suspect that what we refer to as the intellect is a very, very recent transformation in human consciousness, and that its progenitors were far more diversely dimensionalized and vital and responsive to our hearts, right? To our intuition, to our felt sense of being, you know, in a way that partly resembles children, but partly resembles wise people at the same time. I mean, if you have, for example, an old trireme ship, right? And you can use it to explore the ocean, but you didn't really trust that it was a good ship because parts of it were more ambiguous than others, like the hull, right? The skeleton of the ship is what's really dependable, right? In fact, the skeleton is what you depend on, so that's the dependable thing. Great, well, if you throw away the rest of that ship, the skeleton's no longer dependable, right? You can be as confident as you want about how incredibly well made that skeleton is. The moment you put it in the water of actual relation with actual intelligences and beings, it fails. It just sinks. And we've got a similar problem with intellect. Now, I was noticing earlier, you know, we bring intent with us, whether we are relating with or even beginning to observe phenomenon. And maybe observation and relation are two terms for the same essential thing. Just tying my scarf here. And this brings to mind the astonishing profundity, to me, of the analogy of which actual seeing, looking, is far above this analogy, not below it, not beneath it. It's not encompassed by it. A feature that's often overlooked is pointed at by this analogy. But the analogy that the gaze is like a hand in light, right? So that upon which the gaze, that over which the gaze travels or upon which it comes to rest, along that gaze is communicated the intent of the one looking, whether conscious or not. In the same way that to touch something, we touch it with a certain array of qualities, right? Like, I'm grabbing this knife to cut something, or I'm petting the pet, or I'm lovingly making the food, or I'm frustratedly making the food, right? Everything we touch with our hands, somehow the spirit that moves before our bodies do, the essence that moves before our bodies do, instruct whether we're gentle or playful or fierce or severe or, crushing or what, yeah? And this is particularly true when we touch each other, right? Certain kinds of touching don't feel good. Other kinds feel nice at the right time. So there's this old idea that our gaze is really like the invisible hand of our essence or our souls. And so when we use our gaze, I think, again, because we were told, no, seeing isn't touching things. In fact, it's not a rational thought that to see is to caress or to crave or to adore or to despise or to become fearful. Yet those of us who see probably can sense that all of these things are involved, whether or not they'd like to admit my analogy. And I'm saying things are much more profound than that. I'm saying that's a crude model of something really astonishing that's actually going on, that our representational systems cannot cope with, which is part of why they don't represent it. Not only can it not be encompassed by language, it's inconceivable in the paradigms we're trained to think in and to the ways we're trained to use categories. We respond to observation. A friend was last night explaining to me how the unspoken rules of a social engagement at tango, if I remember correctly, called a tanda. The rules require, the unspoken ones, that the man doesn't verbally ask the woman to dance. It is done. They select their dance partners with the eyes, primarily. And there's a non-verbal pre-dance of ambiguous possibility that occurs. But if a man were to actually walk up and say, even very politely, "Would you care to dance?" someone who understood the spirit of the tanda would refuse. Every time. And this is part of what I'm trying to illustrate, is that when we look at older forms of tradition and relation and culture, we find evidence of all these things that our very rational modern mind seeks to dismiss. In fact, though we call it rational, we're likely to put some object above the dividing line and nothing below it, or some incredibly delimited skeleton of what otherwise might have been a ratio worth being involved in. So part of my point here is that observation transforms us dramatically, and this is I want to talk mostly about the flip side of surveillance, because I think we all know that being observed changes our way of being in our bodies, in our awareness, the motivations that therefrom emerge, our habits. And on the one hand, we want two wings on this bird. We want to be observed in those expressions of ourselves that we want to observe, that we intend, that face out toward observers in particular, like mom and dad if I'm a kid, or an audience if I'm a comedian, right? We certainly want, the comedian wants to be observed, right? The child's, mommy, look at me, wants to be observed. And this is an incredibly sophisticated topic, which I'm just going to say a few modest things about today. Then there's the other thing of we really don't want to be observed in our privacy, and we don't want to be surveilled, particularly in situations that make us vulnerable to execution or impoverishment at the whim of some surveiller. We don't want to be the research subjects in a lab whose intent is malignant, and we don't want to be observed in any lab that we didn't actually completely willingly, with awareness, sign up for. And maybe we would sign up for very few if we weren't being paid somehow, or being, having some seeming benefit transferred to us. But we are animals that are profoundly sensitive to observation, such that it can radically transform who we are, what we do, how we think, our relationships with our intellect or our hearts, our motivations, our intentions, dramatically and instantaneously. And it's possible to observe so lovingly, with such inspiration and enthusiasm and wonder and joy, that those beings upon whom our gaze falls, so to speak, the beings whom our gaze touches, light up, right? This is one of the capacities of intent and observation and the gaze. Though it's hard to formally have that intent and execute it. It's not an executable. It's not an algorithm. It's not a code. It's an emotion. It is the movement of the heartfully sensitive aspects of ourselves. It's not a rule. And if made a rule, it dies in the same way that the man formally asking the woman to dance fails every time. It's the wrong form, and it's too concrete. And it too completely delineates the roles. Even if, in fact, in visual exchanges, it may be common for the man to propose the dance. I don't know. I was placing my hand on a tree, and someone was passing me, and I was aware she was observing me. I believe that she was an older Japanese woman. my felt sense of her proximity transformed what was happening between me and the tree. I felt a surge of intensity and reverence that on my own, I'm not sure I would have experienced. And I don't know whether this is because I was imagining something in my mind, which is entirely possible. And indeed, there was some aspect of my imagination that was engagedly aware. And perhaps I was being gazed upon. I don't know. I can't tell you the statistics on this one. I just know that as that woman passed me, I felt this beautiful surge of enthusiasm and reverence, and my heart sort of awoke and got in on the conversation. And I was responding to being observed. There are some things we won't do generally, some things we might otherwise do that we won't do if we're aware that we're being observed. But there's a flip side to surveillance, which is positive surveillance, right? Being seen by those whose attention inspires or transforms us, calls us to a higher, a better, a more diverse and beneficial way of being in the moment. And here, in our cultures, we're trained to use negative observation very adeptly, but the real powerful thing is positive surveillance. To have the attention and concern and awareness of beings that we love, people that we love and want to be seen and known by. And I got to tell you, to have the positive surveillance of nature is a grace you don't want to pass through human life without experiencing. Because you won't know what it means to be human if you don't have this experience. And maybe I'm making a really severe, recommendation here, but it's truly heartfelt, it's not intellectual. If you don't know what it's like to have a living place look kindly on you, wow. It's like a fish that's never been wet. That somehow was kept alive in some bizarre laboratory of intellect, right? You want to, trust me, if you think things you enjoy are good, you should understand the origin of goodness, and it's not in things. It's in positive relational surveillance of other beings, living places, and in play with them, and in relation with them, and adventuring together, and being one body together, knowing that you can sense that this place knows me and loves me, and as I love it, and that I am its human body and it is my organismal body, and this kind of thing. This is some really wonderful stuff. That's part of why people are really interested in intoxicants, is because they hope to have some taste of that. Unfortunately, I think intoxicants, with some few exceptions, are more inclined to interfere and to put a frame there that you might be better off not having, not having intrude. Now again, I'm really just introducing this topic. I think I have another video or two about it, but and I'm not really that interested in the whole quantum physics argument about, even though I could use it as an analogy about the intent being like mechanical observation in quantum physics that transforms, it collapses the cloud. It's a really useful and interesting analogy. And I'm not dismissing it. I just don't want to reinforce it, because then we'll have a frame, right? Yet, the analogy has important features. There's the living places and the living beings. They are fields of potential just as we are. And as we come together, those fields of potential start to disambiguate in a way that I am reminded of by the request of the glance in the tanda, right? And when we look directly at something, if our gaze is like touching with our spirit, looking very directly at a thing could be seen as intrusive or insensitive, right? An approach from the side is often useful, and one of the things that's nice about humility when it's true is it helps ensure that my gaze is one of reverence and offering and is plaintive and is respectful. Now, these may seem very subtle things, and perhaps in our modern environment they are. But they must, it is crucial to me that we recover the faculties and relationships that are ejected into the void of intellect and statement and concrete disambiguation and naming and all of this. Which isn't to say those things are only bad. Again, where they overwhelm and deprive us of opportunity, that's too intrusive. Maybe it's in the wrong context, right? Intellect has appropriate contexts for its intelligent application. And intellect is capable of forming sort of returning dimensionality that would otherwise be dismissed to thought and conception. So these are a few of the things that were on my mind, but I've not yet spoken of time much. And so what I'm going to do is just say a few things. Each of the organisms and the organisms that compose the organisms, their cells, these are layers of living temporality. And they're so profound and so staggering because each organism is at once individual-like, while at the same time always being an organ in this multi-layered, astonishing manifold of life and being and awareness. So they're never completely individual, and you can't make them that way even in a lab. You can separate one cell from all other things and look at it, and that's a really weird thing to do because in nature that doesn't really happen, and I'm not sure the walls of the laboratory and the walls of the enclosure actually successfully accomplish concrete distinction of a cell because there's all these layers that aren't merely space in which the cell participates and of which the cell is an instance of. So the thing about time is that it's relational. You have to have at least two things in relation to have time at all. And if those things are beings, the kind of time you get is completely different than if they're objects. Oh, wow, condor. So there are trillions and trillions and uncountable trillions of organisms on Earth alive right at this moment. And each one of them is a local experiencer of time and producer of time in relation with other beings. So time is time is a many-splendored thing. that our models of it flatten and crush down to, well, metrics. But time is, by splendored, I mean diversely embodied, expressed, experienced, enriched in the between of all beings. And I noticed today something surprising. I'm a fan of Alfred Korzybyskian, and he refers to, in his work, he talks about how one of the things that differentiates us from other organisms is that we are time binders. But I think what he means is that we bind time cognitively, conceptually, linguistically, in formal representational cognition. And what he means by that is we transfer the history of what we've done so far to our children in a layer that isn't merely that's like supra-embodied, the layer of thinking and minds and stuff, right? So he says that we bind time in this way. I'd probably have picked a better phrase, but I understand what he means, right? We undergo in languaging and enculturation in childhood, and are thus assets, well, we hope they're assets, in many cases they're deficits, that were previously established in our language and conceptual context and time, culture, so on. These are transferred, and we undergo uptake and are thus transformed by them. And I think that's reasonable. Yeah. It's not a bad model. It seems to match pretty well what happens for most of us, though it happens uniquely for each one of us. And one of the things that often isn't discussed here is the difference between declaration and connotation, right? The associations that a concept or a word or a phrase has for us as a unique individual, as well as those that it commonly has in generalized populations. But that's not really important. What I noticed and what I was very surprised by was we are time skippers. We keep inventing new ways to skip over what would have otherwise involved relational investment, presence, care, concern, awareness. Our species has this fascinated addiction to finding new ways to skip over the space in which relation would otherwise occur. And we call these technologies, right? If you have to walk through a landscape, you're going to have one kind of, you're going to have a relatively intimate relationship, if you're not just distracted, with that landscape and all, and the continuum between the beginning and end of your journey. If instead you're on a horse, you're going to have a different, very different, because now you've included another organism with you, and its senses and yours start to get mixed together, and something very interesting is going on there. But you can go faster than you can on foot. You can get across the gap quicker. And if you use a bicycle, you can get across the gap quicker. If you use a motorcycle, quicker. A car, quicker. A jet, very quick. And in fact, when we do this with a jet, we usually experience this kind of illness that we call jet lag, but actually it's us having skipped time, right? We went into a relational superposition over time and distance, and we traveled between two places faster than any organism ever did in the history of the world, most likely. And so part of what's happening is just temporal displacement, right? The temporalities in which we're enmeshed in a given place, like my apartment or this park, are very unique to that place. And if suddenly I not only leave them, but I go into a position where they're no longer very relevant or present, and then I travel over a great distance very quickly, and then I land, right? I've skipped over the interval. And this strange desire has intruded into every aspect of our lives. So that instead of having adventures, we watch shows. We observe people who planned for us to observe them, enacting things which are not real for them. That's some pretty interesting diagnostic material there. But yeah, I noticed and was surprised that it's not just that we're time binders. We want to skip over the interval. And all of our technologies, what the things we call conveniences, these are primarily methods of skipping relating with things mindfully, presently, heartfully, with awareness, with meaningful purposive intelligence and care. And one of the things that happens as we keep skipping over these intervals and introducing new ways to skip and new kinds of skipping and new distances to cross, which we've done very adeptly, while pretending we're connecting stuff and people, is that the pace of intrusive, non-relational, time-skipping seductions keeps increasing, and along with that, there's a whole array of noise, electromagnetic, audible, relational, and in the absence of the relations that we otherwise would have pursued and embodied and experienced, something very malignant is seething, in my view. So we aren't just time binders, we're time skippers. And the more different aspects of our life we are encouraged to skip over for convenience, the more we become profoundly attached in a weirdly superficial way. I know it sounds oxymoronic, but I did mention that paradox might be important here. We get profoundly attached in a very superficial way to representations because they represent the time we were absent from. And those can be objects like newspapers or printouts or books or even garbage, right? Because not having lived in the time, we may cling to the artifacted remains of our failure to do so as if it held the promise of returning that time to us, which it doesn't. But this may be an aspect of why each of us variously hoards certain kinds of things unless we don't. When I walk here in the garden, I return to something resembling living temporality, unless I'm making a recording. Even then, I'm still in the field of it, right? It's nearby, and I'm sensitive a little bit. But it's when I walk without my device that I've got a shot at being present. Observation, intent, time. The transformations possible under the encouraging gaze of the positive observation of a living place where people we love or hope to have meaningful relationships with. Thanks for joining me.